Hi, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're logging on. Definitely give yourself a pat on the back for logging on to an online lecture. That's definitely a force, but I appreciate you for being here. I did see that I've already recorded chapter 2 and it is posted within the files section. But I'm going to see if I can do it in a more concise way and see if I've gotten any better. So let's see. So I'm going to share my screen and bring us to the PowerPoints for this chapter, which is chapter 2, sociological research, kind of covering research methodology in general, which is largely the same for every discipline, but there's a few niche things in sociology that we'll cover. So first of all, some basic concepts, empirical evidence. This is anything that's gathered, like any gathered data that's gathered in a kind of official way using the scientific method and also considering ethics. So whether that's like someone's perspective through an interview or, gathering data or participant observation or using experiments, right? Anything that's kind of thorough and has been thought about in terms of ethics and methodology, we can consider empirical evidence. In terms of scientific method, this is something that, I think a lot of us have seen kind of on the back of the science store since middle school, but I think it's important because sociological research and any sort of kind of humanities social science research, we also use a scientific method, right? So first of all, asking your general question, like what is it that you're curious about? What's your topic? Once you have your topic, you want to research existing sources. This is called a literature review. And this is where your goal is to read as much as possible, hopefully everything on the topic that exists. What have people published so far? What kind of experiments and interviews have been done so that you can be more informed when you consider your hypothesis, which is pretty much making some sort of prediction about which way your answer is going to go after your kind of experiment or interviews. Then you actually, design your study in terms of, am I going to do interviews? Am I going to do, am I going to collect data through a survey that I send out online? Um, as we talked about, there's quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data has to do with numbers. Qualitative data doesn't so much. It's more so like interviews and observation. So you want to figure out what kind of methodology works best to answer your hypothesis, your research question. And based on that, you move forward. And then from that, once you've finished that and kind of done your analysis and come to your conclusions, you can kind of talk about that in terms of why was the research important? Like, what did you learn? And also, what suggestions do you have for future research within this topic? Um, Also, a good place to put your limitations in terms of what you weren't able to do in the study but that should possibly be done in the future. And then you want to report your results. Results is largely conclusion is more so like a discussion about what you found, whereas results is more so reporting the actual numbers or reporting the actual data. I guess that's how I think about it. Like conclusions is kind of more so a discussion, suggestions, and reporting results is more so the more mathematical part of it typically. Um, but even with qualitative research, you can report results in a qualitative way as well. So it's not just for quantitative research. Um, yeah, so first of all, when you're going through the scientific method, the first thing is asking a question. You want your question to be narrow enough, which just means specific enough, that, you're not studying everything, but studying a specific thing or group of people or whatever. But you also want it to be broad enough to the point where if it's so niche that you can't find participants, you're not really going to be able to do it, right? So there's kind of this balance between broad and narrow questions. And it's just saying, make sure it's not too narrow, not too broad, somewhere in the middle where you'll be able to do something to answer the question, where it's not so niche that you don't have participants, but also not so broad that you're studying way too many things. You gotta bring it down to something of focus, right? Step two, like I said, literature review. I talked about this earlier. This is where you read as much as possible, hopefully everything that exists within your topic, to make sure that you are familiar with the foundational sources and that, you are then prepared to add on to that. Hypothesis, there's usually a independent and dependent variable, right? And the way that I struggled with this for a second, but the way I think about it, which is silly, is like the dependent variable is quite literally dependent on the independent variable. So independent variables are more so things like these things, how I think about independent variables is like they don't change. They exist as itself. So for example, really any sort of like demographic, right? And by demographics, I mean you can look up demographics, but you know, whether that's race, age, sex, gender, income, educational attainment, right? All of these things, these are kind of like if you're taking a survey and you're answering the question, there's kind of one thing there, and it is what it is. It's unchanging typically. But then the dependent variable is dependent on these things, on the independent variable. So if I want to look at, let's say, my thesis, I was looking at like police brutality and like how people feel about different policy decisions, right? So let's say like strict versus like lax kind of policies on policing. So I might be looking at like, okay, do people, you know, let's just make it simple, approve or, you know, not approve of a policy that would address police brutality. This is pretty much what my thesis was. Just wanted to write this out, sorry. Yeah, so if the dependent variable is, it would be approve or not approve, right? They either approved or didn't approve. And you're saying, are these people going to approve or not approve of this policy based on these things, right? So does your race impact whether you would vote for this policy or not? Does your age impact whether you would vote for this policy or not? Does your gender impact whether you would vote for this policy or not? Does your educational status impact whether you would vote for this policy or not? So you can say approve or not approve, or like, you know, voting for a policy that would address police brutality. So typically the dependent variable is kind of like this or this, and how does the independent variables impact the dependent variables? So kind of think of independent variables as unchanging. They exist, you know, in a kind of more objective reality, where a dependent variable is kind of what's going to shift. And you're looking at how these things, the independent variables, cause the dependent variables to shift. Okay. Usually there's just one dependent variable and a bunch of independent variables, but sometimes there's multiple dependent variables if you want to get crazy like that. That's cool. But typically you'll see a lot of independent variables and a main dependent variable of focus that a study is focusing in on. But moving on, this is important operational definitions or just even the idea of operationalizing. I'm trying to like how do I spell that? Operationalizing definitions. So for example, let's say that I want to do a study and I want to measure people's happiness, right? Who determines what happiness is and how we determine that, right? Is happiness life satisfaction? Is happiness like the percent of the day that you actually do feel in a good mood? Is happiness like success? Is like how I define happiness is going to be way different than how you define happiness. Like what you think happiness is may be vastly different than what makes me happy. But then beyond that, okay, so now we're researching happiness. How do we measure happiness in a way that will kind of include everybody's version or kind of consider all these different ways that you might. So for example, we have factors and we have variables. The factor, which is like the overart, like the umbrella thing that you're searching, let's say our factor is happiness. So we know that our factor is happiness. That's the overarching thing that we want to study. But then how do we measure that? How do we measure happiness? So you use multiple variables. So for example, let's say you take a survey and the survey is on how happy are you? There might be 10 different questions, right? That ask kind of in different ways about different aspects of happiness. That's kind of what it's like, where they're trying to measure happiness as the overarching term, but then they're going to give you different questions that address different things. And those are kind of the variables. So if you're trying to have your factor be happiness, some of your variables might be like self-satisfaction, maybe like perception of like luck or how often they have happy moments. You could say like, I don't know. I don't know. How would you measure happiness? Like, I guess just think about it. Like think, I don't know, job satisfaction. I wonder if it'd be like a bunch of satisfaction type things, like relationship satisfaction. I wonder if it would kind of go into like a lot of different like satisfaction things. But the reality is you can think about a bunch of different ways that you might ask somebody, and then all of those variables together, when we conjoin kind of the total score of these things, we can kind of have an idea of the overall factor, which is happiness. So, it's one of those things where it's so complicated that you would need to ask a lot of questions to kind of have a good gauge on it. And then it's interesting because, well, if we have three different studies that measure happiness, are they all measuring it in the same way? Not always. Sometimes with certain things, there will be a very established definition, right? So if I wanted to do a study on happiness, my advisors would say, hey, don't go create a whole new scale. Find a scale that's already been given the thumbs up. Like find a scale that's already been created on happiness that people agree upon. Like maybe if I look at the literature, I'll see that a lot of people are using the same happiness scale. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. If that's the established happiness scale that everyone in the scientific community has agreed upon, cool, I'm gonna just copy and paste that. I don't need to make up a whole new scale because then we have incongruence between studies. Whereas if all the studies use the same happiness scale, then we might have something more interesting, right? Because everyone's measuring it in the same way. So how does your particular experiment kind of shed light on that more? But I digress. It's fine. So pretty much operationalizing a definition is really just telling you how you're going to define that word throughout your study. I did this in my thesis where, I had a whole page of just definitions. So, because what happens in sociology a lot is like, like the way that you define a group, like that we're just like, oh, groups of people. In sociology, there's a bunch of different types of groups, and we have to be very specific about what we mean when we say group. There's groups, there's aggregates, there's crowds, there's masses, right? So if I'm writing a paper about something about crowds and groups, I would need to make sure that I'm operationalizing my definitions. I almost want to put in a definition section, like keywords, right? Where I'm like, when I say group, I mean this. When I say crowd, I mean this. When I say mass, I mean this. When I say aggregate, I mean this. And this is good so that when you're reading the research, you know what the heck they're talking about. And it's also good because I lost my train of thought. It's fine, but it's helpful so that when you're reading the research, like you know what they're talking about. If they're talking about happiness, you know what they mean by happiness. And then you can kind of decide whether you agree with that definition or not, and maybe move on to another paper that operationalizes the definition in a way that you like. But whatever. Moving on, reliability and validity. Reliability and validity. Reliability so refers to how likely research results are to be replicated. So reliability, you can almost think of like replicability. So for example, if I give you a survey on happiness, let's say that's actually not a good one because your happiness can change over time. So like that's not really a good example. Well, what is really reliable, a test that's known to be incredibly reliable is typically like the SAT, the GRE, the ACT, the what's that last one? The IQ test. These are all very reliable tests. And what I mean by that is if I took the IQ test at 5, well, that's a little bit early. No. Let's say I take the IQ test at 15 and I take the IQ test at 25 and I take it at 35 and I take it at 45 and 55 and 65, it's gonna be the same answer within a few points. Like it's not like I'm gonna go from like a 60 IQ to an 100 IQ, right? It doesn't happen. It's a very reliable measure. If your IQ is 100 at 14, it's gonna be 100 at 24 and it's gonna be 100 at 34. It's not going anywhere, right? So it's reliable. Every time people take those, they get the same score. Validity is like the way I remember this is like so silly. How I think about this is like, does the test, I'm about to write test so many times. Does the test what it says it's going to test? Um, I don't know if that's helpful or worse, but does the test what it says it's going to test? So for example, if I gave you a test and I was like, hey, I'm measuring like how bad your road rage is, but then like every question on the test is like what kind of it's about pizza, like how do you like your pizza, what toppings do you like on your pizza, like how do you like your pizza cooked. Low validity test, right? The test was supposed to be about road rage, but all the questions have to do with pizza, right? So it's like, does the test actually test what it's supposed to, right? So if the test was saying, let's go back to happiness, let's say the test was like, I'm gonna like, it's a happiness test, we're gonna measure how happy you are, but then it's asking you about like your favorite color, your favorite ice cream, or like your where you grew up, or like food, how many friends you have. Like maybe it's like you're looking at the questions and you're like, this has nothing to do with what the test is supposed to be testing. It has nothing to do with the theme. They're not even asking me questions that are relevant. Like, how are these questions? And I get them an answer that is actually valid. So the validity is the test valid? Like, is the test doing what it needs to do to be able to get the answers that it's claiming to? Um, so reliability is like every time you take the test, it should be the same. Like if I gave you a test on how much you like cats, it'd be really weird if like the result was different like now and then in 5 years, like unless you suddenly started to hate cats. But whatever, there's tests that, are reliable. You get the same answer every time. And validity is the test valid? Like, does it actually test what it purports to? Is it testing what it's claiming to? Um, and typically the goal is to have both validity and reliability. But for example, the IQ test is known to have very high reliability. You're going to get the same IQ every time, but the validity is very low. A lot of people for years have been arguing, does the IQ test actually measure like smartness or knowledge, right? And for example, um, I think about this types of intelligence, right? There's so many different types of intelligence. This is going to be a small one, but for example, oh, the dog. I use this a lot, but just looking at different types of intelligence, like there's mathematical, existential, interpersonal, bodily, kinesthetic, like people who are in the gym or like are really good at skiing or sports, right? Linguistics, maybe you're good at poetry, you're good at speaking, maybe spoken word, right? Maybe even comedy. Intrapersonal is understanding yourself. Interpersonal is understanding other people, maybe good at psychology or it might be a good therapist. Spatial, visualizing the world in 3D, like Legos, how you put things together, right? Naturalist, maybe you're really good at plants or like, I don't know, stars or something. And then musical, right? Maybe you're fantastic at the violin or the piano or the drums. But of these things, what does the IQ test test? And same thing with the GRE and the SAT and the ACT. They're really all testing reading comprehension, writing, and then like a math and sometimes a science section. It's very much in line with like the white male ideology. Like these are the things that like white men are usually good at. And therefore everybody else should be too and should just fall in line. But it's interesting because the IQ test isn't going to tell someone if you're really good at growing plants or like fruits and veggies, or like if you're really good at communicating with people, or if you're a fantastic musician, or if you just I was just thinking about how I just hit like 400 on the incline leg press. So I'm like, a test is never, IQ test is never going to be able to measure that. So it's just interesting. So I would argue that the IQ test is reliable, but not valid. And I'll get more into that in class, but that's kind of a little overview of reliability and validity. Next step is drawing conclusions, drawing conclusions. I'm not going to get into polling errors, but then, reporting results. Usually in conclusion, there's kind of a discussion about why does this matter? Like, what was most important in these findings? Why do I think it's important? How do I think this might be helpful for future research or future policy decisions? That's what you're doing in the conclusion. Whereas the results is where you're really reporting like on the more technical, so I don't want to say quantitative side, but like more technical side where you're like reporting like your findings without really discussing them. Just like, here's the hard facts. Um, so let me go on to like, sorry, let me skip through. I digress, not me ranting. But primary data source collection, this really the difference here Primary source collection means that you yourself went and collected the data. You did the interviews by yourself. You created the survey and you sent it out by yourself or with your team, whatever. Whereas secondary data analysis is when you're using data that already exists. So for example, when you go for your master's and you're working on your thesis, which you don't have a lot of time to do, a lot of the professors and advisors will suggest just use secondary data. To collect primary data, to collect data on your own, it's a process. You have to go through a lot of paperwork, a lot of approvals, a lot of revisions. And it could take a really, really long time to, create your survey, send it out, get the responses, review the responses. So sometimes it's easier to use a secondary data source that already exists. So secondary just means that like if I were writing a paper and I used a source that already existed rather than data that I collected on my own. Totally cool to use secondary data and it speeds up the research process a lot. If you don't have to go through all like the amount of paperwork you have to go through to even begin to do a primary source collection is absolutely brutal. I encourage it, it's fun, but it's brutal. So primary data collection, or yeah. So of course surveys, I think we all know what surveys are, like little quizzes that are sent out that ask you questions, right? Population and sample is important in sociology, especially in research, because, okay, let's say I wanted to do a study of queer people in DC. The population is queer people in DC. The sample is how many queer people in DC I was actually able to survey, right? Let's say that I want to look at Black people in Maryland. The population would be Black people in Maryland, and the sample would be the amount of Black people in Maryland I was actually able to talk to, right? So for example, let's say that we're saying, I don't know, we want to do a survey on the people of DC, right? But there's millions of people, not millions, there's like 700,000 people in DC, I think. So if you were to do a study on people in DC, there's no way you're going to be able to ask all of those 700,000 people the questions that you want to. So that's why we do a sample. A sample is just a subset of the population. We are very aware that there's no way you'd be able to survey or interview everyone in DC. So rather than do that, we take a smaller sample and we try to make sure that the sample is representative of the population. So again, if you wanted to look at people in DC, you'd really want in your sample there to be men, women, people of all different educational statuses, people of all different economic statuses, socioeconomic status, whatever. You want to look at people of different ages, of different family size groups, and people in suburban, urban, and rural areas. You'd want to look at Northwest DC, people in Southeast DC, people, you'd want to look at all the different wards, Ward 1 through 8, right? You'd want to make sure that there's representation from all the different groups in DC, right? So you can't get everybody, but you do want to make sure that your sample is representative. Random sample, the random sample, like choosing people randomly can sometimes help the sample be more representative, but sometimes not. But random samples are generally good. Got this up in class today. Quantitative data, think quantitative, anything numerical. Even surveys are sent out on a Likert scale. So if it says like strongly disagree, in the middle, agree, strongly agree, even that is numerical because strongly disagree is at equal 1 and strongly agree is at equal 5. And we can easily kind of do a mathematical statistical analysis based off of that. If there's like a Likert scale like that. We're like, oh, how much do you like this? Rate from 1 to 5, or like strongly disagree to strongly agree, stuff like that. We are able to transmit that into data, quantitative data very easily. Qualitative data is typically more subjective, but interviews, group interviews, participant observation, that kind of thing. And I think they have more examples of that later. Field research is like, really think about the word natural environment, right? So let's say that you want to study like kids on the playground. If you want to study them in their natural environment, first of all, you're definitely not going to interact with them because you interacting with them is like messing up their natural environment. You almost want to be back. You want to be not noticed as much as possible. Even you sitting on that bench in the playground might throw off some kids in the way that they like actually act. So if you're really trying to gather data from a natural environment, you want to make yourself as invisible as possible and make sure that your presence isn't at all influencing that environment, which can be tricky, but important. So that's what we mean by like, well, I don't know. Yeah, the natural environment thing, you're really trying to not mess with any other. You want to stay out of it as a variable or as a factor, whatever. We talked about this. We talked about this. Correlation, I would really like you all to go to YouTube, go to, I'm just going to show you, um, if you just put in ice cream and drowning, I know that's crazy, but if you put in ice cream and drowning and look at this video, it's 6 minutes. The danger of mixing up causality and correlation, she's gonna explain it well. She's gonna explain it well. And then we'll talk about it more in class. But definitely watch that video. That's your homework as of now. So then, types of field research, there's participant observation. This is not natural environment. This is, well, this is when you actually participate. So this happens a lot with like cults, right? Like when a researcher goes and becomes a part of the cult to be able to like understand it better, or like do an expose or whatever, like that's participant observation. Like you were actually participating in the group, right? And people will argue whether that's like ethical or not. I've definitely read some ethnographies, or I'm definitely into cult stuff. I've read there's this one by this lady who was studying the Moonies, look them up. And she felt it was unethical to pretend to be a Moonie. So she made a relationship with some of the Moonies and she was like, listen, I'm not going to pretend to be a part. But a lot of people are saying negative things about you in the newspaper. And then, if I can come in and kind of observe, then maybe I can try to help to plead your case. So I appreciated that she was like honest and she was like, so I don't know. Whereas some people will pretend to be part of the cult and that might end up being harmful for some people mentally. I'm thinking about the movie Kumare, but we'll get there in the religion section. So ethnography, this is studying a complete social setting and all that it entails. We'll kind of get more into that. It's just a type of research and a type of reporting. Almost like you could almost think of it like a biography, like a biography from like a social scientist perspective. So not on a person, but on a setting. In a biography, you want to make sure you have everything from like their birth to their death and like all of the important and all the messy and all the in between. Same thing with ethnography. It's like writing a biography on a place or on a period or on like a social group or a setting or an environment. So incorporating all of those factors. So I'm kind of proud of myself. I like that analogy. I'm gonna use that more now. Okay. Secondary data analysis, again, you're using an existing data set. The rest of this doesn't matter, whatever. Faber, we already talked about him. Is there anything else in here that I need? I would definitely look into, there's a lot. We'll definitely talk about a lot of unethical research things that have happened, and I'm sure that you all have some really great examples too, so definitely let's bring this up in class. But I would recommend just to start with Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment. I don't think is Milgram a movie now? Let me see. I'm wondering if I think this is a movie. Yeah, okay. So if you watch the movie Experimenter, this will give you a really good idea of what happened during the Stanley Milgram experiment. It's definitely one of those things where you have to see it and be like, oh my goodness. But essentially, I won't even get into it. I won't even get into it because I don't want this recording to be really long, but I would highly recommend watching this. I'm like, where to watch? Wow, nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Okay, just kidding. And then the other one, Stanford Prison Experiment, right? This one's definitely a movie. You have to watch this if you do a psychology degree. It's like almost like a requirement. It's a pretty good, I want to say it's a pretty good film, but you're definitely just watching it like, oh my gosh, what is going on? Like, I don't know if I would say it's like great. I would just say it's interesting. It's a real social experiment that really happened and it's definitely eye-opening. And this one looks like you can get it free on Tubi. So yeah, okay. This one looks like it's probably a little bit more accessible than the last one, but I would still put both on your movie recommendation list. We can definitely talk more about other unethical experiments that's happened in the past. Um, and it's interesting, there's still unethical experiments that are going on, right? But that's why now we have like a really strict like code of ethics. Let me see if I do like ASA code of ethics. Ethics is really important, right? And this is something that I don't know the year. I'd have to look it up, but oh, American staffing. I meant okay, what about APA? APA, not okay. I was looking for more so like the American Psychological Association or the American Sociological Association. Yeah, here we go. APA, American Psychological Association. You can kind of look it up. Yeah, okay. I was hoping there'd be like this. Yeah, so um yeah, you can click through here, but like privacy, confidentiality, you want to make sure that you have informed consent, right? You need to tell people what you're doing. You need to have their permission. You need to make sure that they're 18 or older, or else they need a parent permission. Um, and then even therapy is funny. Like you need to make sure that if after your like interview, the person is like distressed, you need to offer like therapy or a debrief or something, or at least like a reward, like money or a gift card or something, right? There needs to be, if there's any risk, there needs to be an equivalent reward or resources to help them manage the risk, right? And it's really, really hard to get those types of studies approved, right? Like I remember I had someone, one of my colleagues in my cohort in grad school, he wanted to interview Black men who had gone through police brutality and ask them about it. And everyone was like, no, nope, you won't be doing that. Like that's looking for a lawsuit. Like it's you have to go through so much training and like as a master's student or as an aspiring master's student, we don't have that clearance. Like you need to have your PhD or your doctorate if you are going to go in and ask traumatizing questions. And not that the questions have to be traumatizing, but asking someone to relive a traumatizing moment. Like not just everybody's allowed to do that. You need a lot of training and a lot of paperwork and a lot of like review and explicit permission to be able to do that. And you need, the funding to be able to make sure that if you're asking someone about experiences with police brutality, that you're offering them like resources on therapy or resources on like, I don't know, groups or especially if you're to ask them to relive that, like I'd want more than a $10 like Starbucks gift card, right? Like the risk has to match, the reward should match the risk. So just, consider that. I will say like it's not easy to just do whatever research that you want. There's a lot of gatekeepers and doors to go through, which can be aggravating when you just want to do research, but it's for a reason. It's so that these unethical research situations don't happen anymore. And they are happening less, but I'm sure there's still a lot of crap going on. But I definitely think that this is a fun rabbit hole to go down is to just kind of look up unethical, psychological experiments, maybe sociological, but you'll find more in terms of like psychology, and kind of looking at what have we done in the past and how has that really informed the way that we do research now or the way that what priorities that we have in research now. So that's it for chapter 2. I'm not sure on the timing if I was faster on this one or not, but I hope that I was able to cover more of the important things. And of course, if you have any questions, send me an email. Happy to hop on a Zoom, and we can also review in class on Wednesday. So thanks for sticking around and listening. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you soon. Bye.